Hi everyone, Reading Adam here, taking a slightly quieter tone just because my little one is asleep upstairs. Today I want to talk about Thinking Course. What an excellent title for a book, right? Thinking Course by Edward de Bono, Edward de Bono, I don't know. De Bono, I'm going to say. Edward de Bono. And I had never heard of Edward de Bono before. I just randomly saw this in the library, and I thought, under here it says powerful tools to transform your thinking. I'm always interested in ways to improve my thinking. So I thought I'd give this book a shot. And again, I didn't know anything about Edward de Bono. I guess he's written a ton of books. A ton is the sense that I get from this. I think his bibliography, I mean, he references many of his own books a lot. And I don't know what I think about that. I kind of like to be able to read one book. Like, I don't want to read 20 books from the same author about thinking. I'm quite all right reading just one book. And then if that really, really helps me, taking a little bit of look. But I think this one's just kind of glosses over many of the things that he has developed. I guess this is the guy who invented the phrase lateral thinking. And I think he's come up with a couple of other things that nobody outside of anybody who knows about him would recognize. Lateral thinking might be more recognizable to the well-read or widely read, or perhaps even just very logical people. But there's tons and tons of information in this, but it's all to the point. I like how it's laid out, just like this is a course you're taking. It's to the point, and it has tons of acronyms. So what I'm going to do before I return this book to the library tonight, I'm going to actually go through the acronyms and just kind of write quick notes. This is a book worthy of writing notes for, because after a read through, I find that it really seems like it'll be quite worth it to do the practices that he talks about. I mean, I practiced a little bit as I was reading, but it's as probably most people are like this, where when you're reading a book, and maybe this is something authors don't seem to get. And here I'm thinking critically, which I'll talk more about that later. But do you ever get the sense that an author who's writing a book where he's like, now practice this, or now go do this now? And if you've ever read self-help books, you've seen that before. Doesn't the author understand that you're reading that right now? Like you're engaged in reading, and for most people, unless they just are a voracious reader, most people, when they're locked into reading, that's good enough. You got them reading at least. You got them reading your book. Now you're doing a call to action. Now you want them to do something else. I find that that's always a little bit too much. Perhaps I think Dale Carnegie did it better in his book, where he had just a quick rundown of things. Bullet points, super simplistic summaries of each chapter at the end of the chapter. Something you can very quickly reference, right? I think quick reference is important in a self-help book, not here are practical exercises you can do. There might be some things might really seriously require practical practice lessons. Sorry, I didn't want to say practical and practice in the same sentence, but I guess I did anyway. I got a lot of ums in here, and I apologize about that. It's interesting, though, that's just kind of a thought I had about how an author can structure certain types of self-help. This is a very specific book. It's about thinking and nothing else. And that's my favorite kind of self-help book. I I term this, I include this book in a genre of self-help because we all have to think through our lives, and if you figure out a way to perhaps think better, then why not try that? So I think a lot of the exercises in this book are actually quite good. A lot of them are well, duh, once you've read it. So like one is the very first section, very first exercise is the PMI. And the PMI, I'm going to have to go to it in the chapter here because I don't remember exactly what. Okay, now I remember because I'm looking at it. P stands for plus or good points. So this is just, let's say there's a topic, dog, or whatever, that comes to mind. The topic is a dog. And, okay, you're going to scan that with your thinking. So you're going to PMI it. You're going to think of the plus or the good points. The M stands for minus or the bad points. And I stands for interesting or interesting points. So a good point might be companion. Dogs are good companions. Bad point might be some people are not good at raising dogs, and this makes them dangerous. Interesting point might be dogs are quirky. They're very interesting to watch behave, certain dogs in certain situations. A lot of people get a lot of pleasure out of watching their pets. So that's just a very quick example. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, it's well worth reading yourself and taking notes and then doing the practices, because I found that my thinking, my view of thinking has actually changed a little bit after reading this book. That's how I know it's a good book. And this is one of those cases where somebody's like, wouldn't you spend $30, $40 on a book if it gave you just one thing that made your life better? And this is one of those books. This is one of those books where there's multiple things that might potentially make my life better because it'll change the way I think. So what's the big deal about that, right? So one thing that Mr. Edward de Bono makes a case for in this book is that most errors in thinking are not errors of logic, but they're errors of perception. So again, most errors in thinking are not logical, they're perceptual. And I thought that was pretty interesting because I didn't ever think of thinking like that. And I've read books on thinking before, but everything that I've researched and looked for how to think better, it seems to all gear towards logic. So I've read Aristotle's books on logic. I also read his book on rhetoric. So I'm thinking, I got to study logic. I got to study logic. I got to study, it's quite, for me, it's difficult studying logic. There's no story, there's no moral, there's no lesson. It's like math, and I just don't find that very interesting. I have a very difficult time making that interesting. And then once I do find it interesting at last, and then I actually work at it a little bit, I forget because I'm not, during the day I'm not always thinking, well, does this make sense logically? I'm just not. So I don't know. I mean, that maybe I can't make that a strength of mine. It'd be a great thing if I can make it a strength of mine, but I don't think I can make logic a strength of mine. So by saying a lot of times people have the logic correctly, but because of their perception is wrong, they're going to get it wrong anyway. Because you can have correct logic, but if your premises are not correct, if you're not using the right vocabulary, if you're not even looking at the right thing, it doesn't matter what your logic is. You're still going to get it wrong. So this is what this book is about, being able to perceive things better. So that first exercise, that PMI exercise, is giving you a plus minus, and then what's interesting about something to increase your perception of it. And you can PMI anything. He gives many examples of different things you can PMI, and just practice by PMIing anything you're thinking about. Do a quick PMI on it. In 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes maybe. And he says, just do the exercises and don't take much time doing them. So he doesn't bash logic. He doesn't say that logic doesn't have value. So that's something that should be understood. He's not saying logic's bad or it's a waste of time studying logic. Just that's not the major issue, and it still has value, but it's not. Perception is where his focus is, because in his studies, in his life, and everything he's researched about thinking, perception is what he's found most helpful for people, and he has had a lot of traction with that, with many students in schools across the world who have gained from becoming thinkers in the perceptual way. Whereas how many of us have taken a logic course or read a book on logic, and you're just as befuddled now as you were before. Now it's good to know to at least be able to avoid logical errors and be able to spot very obvious logical problems, but having just pure sound logic all the time, I don't know, maybe it's a waste of time for you. So anyways, this book it's practical. It's not logician thinking for a severe academic environment. This is practical thinking for the everyday man who has to go to work, and he has to figure things out at work, and he has to figure things out in his relationships and figure things out with his family, just everyday life. That's what this book is for, and that's what makes it so valuable. So that's enough about just things that the book's about. You definitely have to read it for yourself. This is one of my key read it for yourself books. But I wanted to dwell a little bit more on something which I had mentioned I was going to get to this, which is about critical thinking. Mr. de Bono does not care for critical thinking. He says, he makes a point that in the West, we have too much emphasis on critical thinking. I don't know about the East. I don't know about Africa or wherever else, but at least in the West, he says there's too much focus on critical thinking. And I took a critical thinking course in high school. I remember it being called critical thinking. I remember college courses where critical thinking was a big deal. Probably every syllabus I've ever read has critical thinking somewhere in there. Critical thinking does seem to be a buzzword or something that our society obviously holds in high esteem. So I thought it was very interesting that Mr. de Bono took a contrarian view to critical thinking, because, and he doesn't say like it's useless. Again, he's not saying it doesn't have value. He's saying that it's overemphasized. And after you read this book, you'll find that when you see others doing critical thinking, maybe perhaps a bit too much, you'll find it a bit off-putting. You'll find it a little annoying, and you'll start to see it everywhere. And that's one of the ways this book can really change you, because already my perception has changed, and I'm trying to figure out ways in which I can be less of a critical thinker. Imagine that. And I'll explain myself. Why would I want to be less of a critical thinker? Because what's different from a critical thinker? A constructive thinker, a creative thinker. Okay, so that's kind of that's sort of an opposite view of thinking from a critical thinker. A critical thinker reads a book and then tears it apart, finds all the errors, all the logical errors, all the continuity errors, all the typos, all the mix-ups and mess-ups, and just problems with the book, and they have a very sharp critical eye. A constructive or creative thinker writes a novel, okay? A critic's not gonna write or create anything themselves. They just tear down what's already there, and people get quite good at that. But the problem is that they do that too much, and they don't do nearly enough of the other stuff, the creative aspects. And a lot of the exercises in his book will help you with being able to think a bit more creatively and constructively about things where in the past you could only really bottleneck into thinking about it critically or trying to tear it down. Nothing wrong with that, but if that's your primary course of thinking, you're gonna bump into issues. So I had realized from reading this book, most of my thinking is based off of critical thinking. A lot of my previous videos to this, a lot of the ways that I read books is like a critical thinker. I'm trying to think of things that could be better. I'm trying to critique the book, right? I'm trying to figure out, oh, look how smart I am because I found this problem in the book, and here's how I would solve that. But it's not just books. It's movies, music, television, people, work, the way people drive. Just driving into work, I'm thinking very critically, and it's very pervasive in my life and probably in yours, where everything you're looking at and thinking about, you're thinking of in some way, in some capacity, you're criticizing it. So you're deconstructing it. You're not thinking laterally, which is just kind of taking the same thing and looking at it from a different perspective. In fact, let me just quick get the lateral thinking definition. Pattern changing is one of the words he uses to describe that. I'm really seriously, I'm still looking for if he gives a clear basic definition of lateral thinking. He wanted to create a word that described the sort of thinking that was concerned with changing perceptions and concepts. He said the word creativity is much too broad and much too vague. It covers artistic expression, all sorts of things which have little to do with changing perceptions and concepts. Okay, so there is like a something that you think, when you do think of a creative type, you're usually probably thinking of an artistic type, right? Lateral thinking is a little bit differently. Humor is a way of lateral thinking. And that's another interesting point when I came across this that I did want to tell you about, and now I'm glad I looked at lateral thinking because it reminds me of it. He says here, it has always amazed me how little attention philosophers, psychologists, and information theorists have paid to humor. Humor is probably the most significant characteristic of the human mind. It tells us much more about how the system works than anything else. Reason tells us very little, and we can devise reasoning systems with pebbles, beads on an abacus, cogwheels, or electronics. But humor can only occur in a self-organizing patterning system of the sort we find in human perception. Humor involves the escape from one pattern and the switching into another. So there you go. There you have it. That's a form of lateral thinking. There are others, but humor is a form of lateral thinking. When you make a joke about something, especially think of like satire or dry humor, you're changing the way you look at something, right? And sometimes you're being critical of it at the same time. But just sort of like observational humor, think Jerry Seinfeld jokes, and you have a good sense of type of thinking he's talking about here. And obviously that kind of thing is very good and successful for certain types of people, Larry David, Jerry Seinfeld, and a host of other comedians who have not committed sexual assault. So that was probably the most this insight into critical thinking, being able to read a contrarian view of critical thinking. It's very interesting, and even if you disagree, challenge yourself by reading his book and reading for yourself his exact view on critical thinking, and see if you agree with any of that. Because I was just thinking today, as I was at work, I was thinking that. Sorry, it's late. I apologize for yawning. That can be quite annoying in a video, but I'm not boring myself. I'm just tired. I was at work today, and in every job I've ever had, people are expert complainers. They're always finding something that's a problem. Whether it's a manager, a coworker, a process, the job itself, the customer. There's always something. Doesn't matter. When I was student teaching, there were tons of problems that the teachers had with the administration, that teachers had with other teachers, that teachers had with students, students with teachers, students with administration, parents with teachers, teachers with parents, blah, blah, blah. Everybody. There was a problem with everybody. Even working at grocery stores, there's always a problem with something. This manager is a jerk. This manager doesn't know what he's doing. This manager's, he's making us do stuff that we don't need to do. That's nonsensical. We should be doing this other thing. We should be putting focus on this, not that. Call centers, it's just like constant complaining about the customer, constant complaining about the system, the process, and not getting recognition, managers not being really into, not really understanding. I don't know if I've had a job. I mean, when I sold cars, everybody had a problem with something. Mechanics had problems with salesmen, had problems with customers, had problems with the service advisor, service advisor had problems with the owner. Owner had problems with everybody. Finance manager has problems with the salesman, problems with the service people. Service people also have problems with third parties that are involved in the finalization process. Customers have problem with everything. It's just one thing I realized is, and this came to me today, and it's an obvious thing, right? It's one of those things that we know, but we don't always form into words. And today I formed it into a thought. And that thought was, every single person from every job has something to complain about. Yeah, there's that guy who never complains, right? But every single person has some legitimate thing. No matter how petty, it's still somewhat legit, something to complain about. Everybody. And I wonder how much people complain in their jobs, how much of that is a result of our emphasis on critical thinking. I'm curious if the everyday Joe, if some perceptive person, say in Asia, has recognized that just about everybody in their jobs that they've had complains about the job, something about the job. How rare is it to have somebody who doesn't complain, but instead when they think and talk about their job, they're thinking of ways to improve things. They're thinking of ways, creative and lateral thinking ways. How much are they seeing the plus, not just the minus, but the plus and the interesting side of things, and many of these other acronyms in this fine book. It's a thin read, it's a thin book too, so it's a very quick read, and you know what? It's far superior to any blog garbage you're gonna find. So it's just that those were the interesting thoughts that I was getting from this book. I was thinking, like, every single person in any job I've ever had complains incessantly. Some people way more than others. And I'm complaining about other people complaining. I'm thinking very critically and cynically about people at work. And I'm trying to think, like, I've done that myself. Like, I've found lots of things. It's interesting. A lot of people seem to connect and bond at work over complaining about stuff. Just the problem with that is sometimes that eventually involves gossiping about people and then complaining about people, and then those people complain about other people, and you know, that can really make things awkward and sour relationships with people at work, especially because some people are very sensitive, some people are catty. It's a mess. It's a mess. I was wondering, like, I've been raised from school, you know, critical thinking has been always emphasized. How much of that permeates into my everyday thinking? How much of that permeates into everything I think about? So, like I was saying, I see movies very critically. I listen to music very critically. I read very critically, and everybody I hear talk about usually seems somewhat critical. But I feel very drawn to things that aren't. I feel very drawn to people talking about things creatively, talking about things laterally. Very drawn to that. And I wonder if that's because I'm getting breaths of fresh air of this more constructive creative thinking over this ridiculous critical thinking that I'm constantly possessed with in some capacity, not all the time, but in some capacity. Do you ever notice that if you've meditated before? Do you ever notice when you meditate, at least once you're finished meditating, you have that brief period of just kind of peace and tranquility? And do you ever notice how little critical thinking seems important at that moment? I've noticed that. And everybody seems very good at criticizing. When you hear people complain, sorry, 1 second. When you hear people complain, they're usually pretty good at it. They're pretty good. They seem to have very good points that they're making. Things do seem quite ridiculous, but obviously none of it matters. And they would be better off just not complaining at all. But people are good at it because we all spend all our lives emphasizing this and trying to get better at being that way. And I think that draws in a lot of negativity in our lives. So we perceive garbage, and then garbage comes out of us. That's our garbage in, garbage out. We perceive garbage all around us, and then what comes out of us is also garbage, because all we can think about is negatively deconstructing so many things. There are times and places to do that, but obviously people do it too much. And I'm convinced of that, because now when I go out in the world, I see it a lot, and I hear it in others, just general discussions. When you hear people talking about sports, for instance, I don't really enjoy talking about sports because I don't care to memorize players' names. And that seems to be what most sports talk is about, at least from my perception. It's not really about what happened in a game. It's more about, like, this player or that player. And I just have no interest in memorizing players' names or stats or anything like that. But people who discuss sports tend to be talking very critically, right? They tend to be talking about so and so dropped this pass, or messed up that tackle, and it's just, it's how much of it is just basically bashing and criticizing players in the game, or if they do say anything like good about somebody, it'll be like, oh yeah, blah 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 played a really good game last night, and they're like, oh yeah, that one goal he got was really good. It's like, okay, yeah, whatever. But that's just kind of an example that I'm thinking of, just everyday talk, just schmoozing with your neighbor, and how the focus of that conversation, no matter what it is, the focus on that conversation inevitably involves critical thinking. You'll notice it. You'll start to notice it if you listen this far into my talk. One last point I wanted to make about the critical thinking, because I think you understand what I'm saying. One last thing is, one time I did try to write a novel, and it was for November Novel Writing Month. I thought I would go give it a shot. I almost wrote a full novel, almost a full novel. I got bogged down at the end, and I lost interest. I couldn't finish it. So I understand, like, it takes a lot of resolve to finish a book, even a short book. So kudos to anybody who's ever finished a full book. What I learned after I tried my own hand at a novel is I really learned to appreciate novels. I did not appreciate fiction at that point in my life. I preferred nonfiction, and I thought fiction was kind of useless, really. But it's after trying to write a novel, I realized just how smart somebody had to be to make a good book. So that made the classics all the more impressive when I read them, and that made just even bad novels still have quite a degree of good about them. You can always find good about books. There's plenty of things to criticize, easy to criticize. We live in a society where everybody's a critic. But you can really come across very differently if you just talk about all the positive things and the interesting things and leave off the bad things. I don't know if I can do that, but I would like to see if I could try a little bit more. And because I always thought, oh, I can make a really great channel if I can really just destroy a book. And maybe that's not necessary. Maybe that's boring because everybody does that. I've seen channels where they're devoted to a guy ranting about something. It's like, okay, he has valid criticisms, and I'm not saying there's no value in criticism, but it's just funny that channels exist where somebody's criticism is so severe, it's ranting, and that's just kind of the society we live in. But being able to recognize that, being able to know when that's appropriate and when you want to turn that off. If you go on like a social media, I mean, how much of that is critical thinking? How much of that is constructive, creative, humorous, lateral thinking exercises? I mean, when you see people discuss something online, on social media or on a forum, how do you think they talk about something? Right? You're already picturing it. How do you respond to people? If you go through Reddit comments, if you go through forum comments, people talking back and forth, how much of that is creative? How much of that's constructive? How much of that is pure criticism? Right? So it's rare. It's rare. But you can have an edge if you do the thinking exercises. You get off your high horse and you stop caring about whether or not you've successfully criticized something to the point where the author would be in tears. Try to focus on the other aspect of thinking. There's a lot of other aspects of thinking, and Powerful tools to transform your thinking is his subtitle. He gives you the powerful tools. Whether he says powerful tools or tools or, tools, it doesn't matter. They're tools. They're things you can do. But the transform your thinking that's really key. That's something that once I finished the book and thought about it, that really struck me. I mean, he really does transform your thinking, because your perception is changed. And that's transformation. Changing your perception is sometimes all you need to do. Right? I can't remember if it's this book or the book I just read previous to this that gives an example of a perceptual change, which is like you're having an argument with your girlfriend. She starts making you feel bad. And you're about to apologize. But then somebody whispers into your ear saying like, oh man, she's just trying to make you feel guilty. She's just blackmailing your emotions. Suddenly your perception changes. Suddenly you don't feel like apologizing to her. You harden up. So that's just a quick example of just a perceptual change. How quick and easy it is. I could keep talking about this topic for a while, but I'm not going to. You get the point. You understand. If you're not interested in reading this book, picking up at your local library or finding it somewhere, if you're not interested in that by now, maybe I've just planted the seed, and sometime down the road, if you hear his name, or you're thinking that you want to improve your thinking or your ability to see things differently, even in a creative aspect, give it a shot, really. Honestly, give it a shot. You have nothing to lose. You have literally nothing to lose. So I'm going to leave you with that. Again, book Thinking Course, Edward de Bono. Like, subscribe to my channel, share this to anybody who needs to think better. And I apologize if the audio is not so great in this video. I was talking a bit quieter, so that my little one can sleep and not wake up to my melodious voice. But yeah, have a great night. Take care.